Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Today, Mark chapter 5 with our awesome, sweet Rabbi, Michael, the man, Skobac. Welcome back, sir. How are you today?
Baruch Hashem, great.
Good. Awesome.
Great to be here with you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. We really appreciate your time. And I know you're on a tight schedule today, so I'm just going to turn it right over to you. And once again, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. Appreciate that.
So Mark chapter 5 is a bit of a strange chapter, although I probably could say that about almost every chapter we're going to be studying. It begins with a story that takes about 20 verses. So from verse 1 to verse 20 is the story of, sometimes he's called the Maniac, and the person that's demon-possessed, person possessed with unclean spirits. And it takes place, according to Mark, in the land of Gerasenes. Not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but basically something along those lines. That's where the story takes place. And in this location, Jesus encounters a man who has an unclean spirit. And this man is in very bad shape. The story tells us that he lived in various tombs, and no one could bind him even with a heavy chain because he was able to tear shackles apart. He apparently was very, very strong. No one could subdue him. And he would constantly cry out from these tombs and gashed himself with stones. He doesn't sound like a happy camper. He sounds like someone who's deeply troubled. And he sees Jesus from a distance. He runs up to Jesus and he bows down to him. And he cries out, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Now, it's not clear who's talking. Is this the man talking? Is it the demon within Jesus, within the man that's talking? In any event, that's the question that's posed to Jesus. And he goes on and says, "I implore you by God, do not torment me." Because Jesus had been saying to this unclean spirit to come out of the man. So apparently, we sort of have a little bit of background to the scene itself. Jesus had been trying to essentially cast the demons out of this man. And so it seems like really it's the demons that are protesting and saying, "Don't torment me." So Jesus asked the demon its name. And it said, "My name is Legion, because we are many." So apparently it's not just one spirit that's inhabiting this poor person, but it's a whole legion of spirits, of unclean spirits, which means basically a whole host of demons. And the demon, we're told, was begging Jesus not to send them out of the country. So apparently this league, this host of demons, for whatever reason, liked living in the land of Israel. They didn't want Jesus sending them out of the country. So they asked Jesus to send them into a herd of swine. It's very interesting. I mean, you would imagine they would have been very happy just staying where they were, tormenting this poor man. But again, I'm just reading the story. I'm not going to be able to change it. And so they asked Jesus, "Look, we don't want to be sent to another country. Instead, send us into a herd of swine that are feeding here on the mountain." And Jesus gave them permission. That's what it says here in Mark, that Jesus gave these demons permission to go into the herd of swine, and they came out of the man. So this man was now relieved of this demon possession, and the demons entered the herd of swine, and the swine, we're told, then rushed down the steep bank of the mountain, and about 2,000 were drowned in the sea. And the person apparently now had relief. He appears to people to be more normal, and that's essentially the end of the story. Now, what's interesting is that more or less the same story is told in Luke in chapter 8, verses 27 to 37. And Luke essentially tells the same story, basically the same story. But in Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 to 34, you have what seems to be the same story, but with some changed details. Some of the details are different. So in Matthew, it's not the land of the Gerasenes, it's the land of the Gadarenes. Apparently, some of the manuscripts even have a third name for this location, so the location is not clear. And in Matthew, it's not that Jesus is confronted by one man that's demon-possessed, but in Matthew, it's two men that are demon-possessed. And then in Matthew, the demons don't say to Jesus, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" They say, "What do we have to do with you, you Son of God?" So the details are a little bit different, but the ending is the same. In the ending, basically Jesus has these demons enter into the herd of swine, and you have about 2,000 of these animals that basically perish by going over the cliff and into the sea. Now, this is a somewhat disturbing story, because while pigs are not a kosher species, which means that they cannot be eaten by Jews, the reality is that non-Jews are allowed to eat pork. Non-Jews can eat pig, and pigs have many other useful and legitimate, permissible functions. Now, how are we to view Jesus' actions here that led to the destruction of about 2,000 swine? How do we process this? So the first thing we have to be aware of when we think about this story is that there was no need for Jesus to cause the death of these creatures. There are many stories in the Gospels where demons are cast out, but no one is harmed in the process. So, for example, in Mark chapter 1, verse 39, in Mark chapter 7, verses 26 to 30, in Mark chapter 9, verses 38 and 39, in Luke chapter 8, verse 2, in Luke chapter 13, verse 32, and many other stories, Jesus seems perfectly able to cast demons out of people, and no animals have been hurt in this process. Nothing has been hurt in the process. There's no collateral damage. There's no one that's hurt or killed. So the question is, why here? Not just why here, but how do we look at the fact that apparently 2,000 pigs are unnecessarily killed as a result of Jesus's actions? So what is the biblical perspective? How does the Torah see the way we're supposed to treat animals? So we'll begin with Psalm chapter 145, verse 9, which says to us that the Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all of his works. Meaning God is not just merciful to human beings, God is merciful to all of his creatures. And if you continue on in Psalm 145, it says that God opens his hand and he feeds all creatures, not just human beings. Now, the Torah urges human beings to emulate God. This is one of the major teachings of the Torah, is that we're supposed to try to emulate God. If God is kind, if God is generous, if God is slow to anger, all of these qualities and virtues are qualities and virtues that we are supposed to emulate. The Torah says in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 9, V'halachta b'drachav, you shall walk in his ways. So because God is merciful to all living beings, so we see, for example, in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 10, Solomon writes that the righteous one knows the needs of his animal's soul, but the mercies of the wicked are cruel, meaning that by definition, a righteous person is basically concerned about the needs of their animals. And so we find that there is a biblical prohibition against causing any unnecessary pain to animals. Where do we see this? So it's derived from the angel of God who challenged Bilam in the book of Numbers, chapter 22, verse 32. Bilam is challenged by the angel who asks him, "Why did you strike your she-donkey these 3 times?" We know that Bilam was on his donkey going on a mission. He was hoping to get a lot of money and honor by cursing the people of Israel, and God sends an angel to block Bilam on the way. It's interesting because this is the first time in the Torah that you have the word Satan. It's in chapter 22, verse 22, that the angel of the Lord stood Satan to obstruct Bilam. Basically, that's what Satan is. Satan is God's angel that obstructs us in life, that gets in the way, that challenges us, that tries to knock us off our game. And Bilam doesn't see this angel, but his donkey does. And the donkey stops, and the donkey swerves, and the donkey keeps on trying to get out of the way. And each time the donkey stops, Bilam hits it, strikes it. And then not only does the angel challenge Bilam, the donkey turns around and the donkey says to Bilam, "Why are you hitting me? What are you doing this for?" But the angel basically threw the same challenge at Bilam. So what you see from this story is that striking an animal for no reason is not a neutral activity. It's an activity that Bilam is criticized for, and therefore this becomes the source. And you'll find it in later rabbinic literature. Maimonides, for example, tells us there is a biblical prohibition against causing any unnecessary pain to an animal based upon this story. And the truth is, on the contrary, it is our responsibility to alleviate the pain of any creature. For example, the Torah tells us in Exodus chapter 23, verse 5, "If you see the ass of him who hates you," meaning you see the ass of your enemy, that person that hates you, and the ass has fallen to the ground because of its burden. It's overburdened, it's carrying too much weight. The Torah says, "You shall surely not pass him by. You shall surely unload it with him," meaning you are required to help your enemy take the heavy burden off of the enemy's animal because it's causing pain and discomfort to the animal. This is the biblical mandate. And what's amazing is that the Torah has numerous laws about how to treat animals, many more laws than the Torah gives us guidance on how to treat our own children. When you think about that, that's kind of mind-blowing. There's more direction in the Torah about the treatment of animals than the treatment of your own children. So I'll just share a few examples. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4 tells us that we cannot muzzle an ox when it is threshing corn. Imagine the ox is basically pulling a threshing machine, and it is threshing corn for you, and there's corn all over the floor. The ox is surrounded by food. You're not allowed to muzzle the ox, because to the ox it's going to be torture to be in the presence of all this food that it would love to pick up and nibble on. You can't do that. That's basically, in a sense, torturing the poor ox. Or Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 10. which says that you cannot plow with an ox and an ass together. Now, there are two explanations normally given for this. What's the problem with hooking up an ox and an ass together to plow for you? So one simple explanation is that they're of different strength, of different size. The ox is going to pull harder with more force, and it's going to be a drag on the ass that's going to have to try to keep up with the ox. It won't be really comfortable for either of them. The ox will feel that it's being slowed down. The ass is going to feel that it's being pushed too hard. That's one possible way of seeing the prohibition of plowing with an ox and an ass together. Another explanation given is that an ox is a kosher animal, which means that it chews its cud, right? We know that one of the definitions of a kosher animal is that it has to have split hooves and it has to chew its cud, which means that it swallows its food and then it regurgitates it and then it brings it up and it chews it some more. The donkey is not a kosher animal. The ass is not a kosher animal. It doesn't chew its cud. And the problem will be that if the ass is partnered, is yoked together with this ox that's constantly chewing, the donkey is going to feel that this guy that's working with me, he's constantly eating, he's constantly being fed. It's not fair. So there are many reasons why the commentaries explain that it's simply cruel to place an ox and an ass together to work for you, and therefore it should not be done. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 15, we're told that you should not eat before you feed your animals, meaning you have to feed your animals before you eat. And this is based upon the verse there that says, God saying, and I will give grass in your field for your cattle, and you shall eat and be satiated. Meaning first the animal is fed, and then you are fed. Or Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 10, which tells us that on the Sabbath, even your animals have to be allowed to rest. You cannot work your animals on the Sabbath. Or Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 6 to 7, that a mother bird must be sent away before you take its young. You cannot take the young, either the eggs or the chicks, when the mother bird is there present watching. So you have to send away the mother bird. Or Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 21, which basically speaks about the laws of shechita, of ritual slaughter, that if you're going to eat an animal, you have to slaughter it in a certain way. And according to the oral Torah, there are 5 basic laws of how an animal is to be slaughtered. And one of them, just as an example, is that the knife that's used has to be sharper than a samurai sword. When I was studying to be a rabbi in Israel back in 1979, so we spent, I think it was maybe 5 months studying the laws of how to slaughter animals. And we learned about the laws of the knife and how sharp it has to be, and that the knife is checked regularly by rubbing your thumb, the nail and the fleshy part, along the edge of the knife. And if there are any nicks at all, the knife cannot be used. And there was someone that was in the building with me that was studying actually to become a shochet, a slaughterer, and he let me test his knife. And I remember running my finger over this knife, and I was very careful. I didn't want to lose my thumb, but I did this for about 5 minutes, and I told him I cannot feel a thing. It seems as smooth as glass to me. And he told me that the knife was just checked, and there were 3 nicks in it that invalidated it from being able to be used. And there were other laws that, again, basically ensured that the slaughter of the animal will be swift and painless. So we have many laws in the Torah that deal with how we are to treat animals. As a matter of fact, there are entire books written on this topic. I have a book, I'm not sure you'll be able to see it, It's called Tsar Ba'alei Chaim.
There you go. That looks good right there.
Protection of Cruelty, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals by a Rabbi Noah Cohen. It's a 200-page book that just deals with how Torah law governs this question about preventing the pain and cruelty to animals. So this is a very disturbing story we read where 2,000 innocent swine go to their deaths because of something essentially that Jesus does. It's hard to justify this. And just one final thought on this story is, again, we know that Christians like to try to plug Jesus into the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, the chapter about the suffering servant of the Lord. Well, chapter Isaiah 53 verse 9 says that the servant of the Lord didn't do any violence. And certainly I would say that to unnecessarily kill 2,000 swine is an act of violence that really is completely out of step with the morality and ethics of the Torah, which requires tremendous sensitivity when it comes to the treatment of animals. The story goes on now. We're in chapter 5 with verse 21. And again, this is something I'm going to point out as we go through all of the Gospels. The passage here mentions that a great multitude gathered around Jesus by the seashore. And in this chapter, it mentions 3 times the great multitudes that follow him. We'll see the same thing in verse 24 and in verse 31. And again, I've pointed out in the past that Isaiah chapter 53, again, the suffering servant of Isaiah tells us that the servant will be someone who's not popular. The servant will be someone who is despised and rejected. Now, again, if you want to find any example of a people that have been rejected throughout their entire history, it's been the story of the people of Israel. Anti-Semitism has been called history's longest hatred. Yet you see throughout the Gospels, Jesus is, as when I was in high school, we studied the play Jesus Christ Superstar. Well, that's how he's portrayed in the Gospels. He's the most popular guy around. Crowds constantly following him. And of course, after he dies, he becomes the most famous, popular person in the history of the world. So it's very difficult to say about Jesus that he is someone who's roundly despised and rejected. Now, the next story in this chapter is a story that's sort of interrupted in the middle. So it begins with verses 22 to 24 about a synagogue leader named Jairus. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but he has a daughter that's very sick. And he asks Jesus to come and lay hands on his sick daughter, who is basically at death's door. But before the story really goes on and sort of develops, it's interrupted by a story of a woman who is hemorrhagic, meaning that she seems to have uncontrolled bleeding. We're told for 12 years, no doctor was able to help her. And this is in this chapter, verses 25 to 34. So there's a huge crowd around Jesus. Jesus is surrounded by tons of people. And she decides she's going to touch the garment of Jesus. That's what it says here in Mark, that she touched Jesus' garment. Now, when you read the same story in Matthew, it tells us that she touched the fringe of Jesus' garment, which seems to indicate that Jesus on his garment was wearing tzitzit, the ritual fringes. So that's what happens here in this story. And the woman, after she touches Jesus' garment, she feels that the blood is basically drying up in her and that she was healed of her condition. Now, what's interesting is that of all of the gospel writers, Mark has the greatest emphasis on the alleged miracles of Jesus. Even though Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, he seems to have the most miracle stories. I counted 18 miracles in the 16 chapters of Mark. There may be even more that I missed, but it's a major, major focus of Mark's Gospel. Now, it's important to remember that the Gospels are primarily written for evangelistic purposes. The Gospels were not written by journalists or by historians. They were written by evangelists, by people whose main interest was in getting others to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. So, for example, in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 31, John admits, he says, "These have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ," meaning that Jesus is the Messiah. He's telling us straight out, why were these stories written? In order to get people to believe in Jesus. Now, that's less of a historian and really more of a salesperson, right? That's what basically the evangelists are doing. They're selling Jesus. They want to promote the belief in Jesus. We have to remember that when we read things like these miracle stories in the Gospels, because it really, at least at some level, should get us to at least ask ourselves, well, what's the evidence that any of these stories happened? Is there any non-biased corroboration of these stories? I'm going to leave that question just for people to think about, meaning that the only record we have of all these miracles is only in the gospel accounts. The question is, how do the gospel writers make a convincing case for people to believe in Jesus? How are they going to do that? If their interest is in promoting the belief in Jesus, how do they do that? So Matthew, for example, Matthew tries to marshal many prophecies from the Hebrew scriptures that Jesus allegedly fulfilled. That's the methodology of Matthew. More than any other of the gospel writers, Matthew is constantly quoting passages from the TaNaCh that he claims Jesus fulfilled. But when you actually go through these alleged prophecies, they're like cotton candy. If you've ever eaten cotton candy, you know, the minute you bite into it, it disappears. There's nothing there. And so if you ever go through these alleged prophecies that are brought to substantiate the fact that Jesus fulfilled prophecy, they're basically inane, and they are invariably passages from the TaNaCh that are mistranslated, sometimes invented out of whole cloth, and almost always ripped out of context. Now, we covered all of those passages that Matthew cites when we went through Matthew's gospel, and we were able to puncture them very, very easily. So the only other argument that could be made to convince people that Jesus was the Messiah, other than trying to quote these proof texts, is claiming that he did lots of miracles. There are no other arguments that are put forward to basically build the case that Jesus is the Messiah. Either he fulfilled prophecy or he did a lot of miracles. We see that the prophecies don't hold up. What's the problem with claiming that he did all these miracles? Aside from the question of, did he really do anything? Can we really know? Did he really, is there substantiation? But even if we take all the stories at face value, it's important to remember, very important to remember, that the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, never tells us that we'll be able to recognize the Messiah by the miracles that he will do. This is simply never put forward as a criteria for the Messiah. Why is that? Why doesn't the Hebrew Bible ever tell us, you know, you'll be able to see who the Messiah is, because he's going to do mind-blowing miracles. The reason that the TaNaCh, that the Hebrew scriptures never says that, is because basically miracles can never prove that someone is a worthy person, because we constantly see that unworthy people are able to do miracles. So we know, for example, from Deuteronomy chapter 13, God tells us that there are going to be false prophets who will be able to do incredible signs and wonders and miracles. And you can ask the question, if they're false prophets, why would God give them the power? Why would God allow them to do these signs and wonders? And God tells us, I'm going to be doing this to test you. I'm going to be doing this to test you, to see whether you're going to be loyal to following the Torah that I've given you, or you're going to be swayed by people who are able to do these fancy miracles. But that's what God is telling us. Don't assume for a minute that just because someone does a miracle, that is proof positive that they are on my side, God is saying. Do not think that. And the Christian Bible basically says the same exact thing. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 24, Jesus tells his followers that even false messiahs are able to do incredible supernatural miracles that will be able to lead astray even the elect. So again, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. If false messiahs can do miracles, then a miracle could never prove that someone is the real Messiah. And so, how can we tell if someone is actually the Messiah? How do you know whether or not someone is actually the Messiah? So the scriptures paint a very clear picture of what the world will look like when the Messiah is here. And the Messiah is described in scripture as the Davidic king, as the king of Israel from the line of David, who will reign at the time when all of the prophecies that the Bible has about what the world's going to look like when the Messiah is here, when that has been fulfilled, you will know the Messiah is reigning in Jerusalem on the throne of David. That's the simple way that the Bible tells us that we'll be able to recognize the Messiah, not through any miracles that he'll do, simply because he is the reigning king living at the time that the Bible tells us will be the times of the Messiah. The chapter ends with, again, the conclusion of this story of Jairus and his daughter in verses 35 to 43. The story here in Mark tells us that people had thought that his little girl had died. That's what people assumed, that she actually died already. But Jesus says, no, she's not dead. She's just sleeping. Now, what does that mean? She's not dead, she's just sleeping. So I think it could mean that either she's unconscious or she's in a coma, but Jesus is saying very clearly she's not dead. And Jesus tells the little girl to get up, and she gets up and she walks. So aside from what we mentioned a few moments ago about Jesus' alleged miracles and his alleged healings, we should also realize that they were not unique. None of the healings that Jesus does in the Gospels are unique. If you study the Talmud, for example, the Talmud has many, many similar healing stories, even people in the Talmud who are resurrected from the dead takes place. It's not unique to Jesus. So one last thing I want to point out. At the conclusion of this story, the conclusion of the story of Jairus and his daughter, Jesus does something that he often does in the Gospels. It says that he strictly warned everyone present that what happened in Jairus' house stays in Jairus' house, and that no one should blab or speak about it. That's what Jesus tells all the people that are present. Now, I pointed out a few weeks ago that this seems to fly in the face of what Jesus says at his trial to the high priest in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 20, where Jesus says, "Look, I've spoken openly to the world. I've spoken nothing in secret." Jesus claims at his trial that he was a paradigm of full disclosure. No secrets, everything was out in the open. And yet you see constantly in the Gospels that he's telling people after his alleged miracles, don't tell anybody what happened. Keep it to yourself. So there's always cover-ups in the Gospels. And this, again, does not sync well with how the servant of the Lord is portrayed in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, which says there was no deceit in his mouth. Again, I don't know any other word to use when you find someone that basically contradicts himself so blatantly, where throughout the Gospels, he's covering up constantly and telling people to keep things secret. And yet he says to the high priest at his trial, everything was out in the open. There were no secrets. So it seems to me that that doesn't really fit well with how Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7 portrays the servant of the Lord. Okay, my friend.
All right.
That's not the end of Mark 5, but that's the end of what I had to share about Mark 5.
That is perfectly fine. That is perfectly fine. We certainly appreciate a lot of good. It's creating a lot of good chat being generated from all the topics at hand. So, okay, well, let's see. So I know next week is Rosh Hashanah. So what are we going to be on Monday? I know Sunday is out for sure. I guess Sunday, Monday. Is that right?
Well, Monday is on a holiday, but
okay.
What it means is that by Monday morning, I would not have had a chance to even think about Mark chapter 6.
Gotcha.
So Mark chapter 6 is going to have to wait.
That will be fine. Okay, well, that is good to know, my sweet Rabbi. So thank you so much for all you tuning in. Thanks to the moderators out there. Got Andrea and Christo and Larry, my three main was at that. So I appreciate all y'all's hard work and keeping everybody nice and civilized. So. All right. Well, Rabbi, you should have a wonderful week, and Hashem bless you and your household. And tell your wife we appreciate her lending you to us for so long. How far away this is the 7th year right now? I think.
I don't know if it's 7th, 8th, or 9th.
I think it's actually I think it's like maybe in the top of the 9th for you and I.
Top of the 9th.
The channel's been around for almost 10 years, I think.
Oh, yeah. So I think we must be 9 years already.
Yeah, because it was in 2014 is when we started. So interesting. Well, whenever the channel was birthed, it was in 2014. So it's pretty crazy, man. All right. Well, you should have a great weekend.
So I want to wish everyone, you and all the viewers, everyone, a Shana Tova, a good New Year. We know that the Rosh Hashanah is not a Jewish holiday, because Rosh Hashanah basically celebrates the creation of mankind, all human beings. And this is the day on which God judges the whole world, not just the Jewish people.
Right.
So this is a wonderful holiday, really, for everyone in the world. But it's a holiday which is serious in the sense that when we mark the anniversary of our creation, we have to think about whether it was really a worthwhile endeavor by God. So this is really a time of the year for us to take stock, to think about our lives, to think about what we could do better next year, to make some serious resolutions, and to not bite off more than we can chew. One mistake that people always make is to, say next year is going to be a totally different year. I'm going to be a totally different person. We tend not to be able to fulfill such grandiose thinking. So it's good to make very simple, easy to accomplish goals that could be measured, and we could move on from there. So I want to wish everyone a wonderfully sweet and meaningful New Year, and everyone should be blessed and healthy and safe in the coming year, and we should only hear good news.
Amen. Good deal. And for if you're the righteous non-Jew or considered a Noahide, this is your highest holy day, from what I've understood. This is the one where we take into account ourselves. So hope you all will find true meaning in that, and Hashem bless all of you, and we'll see you at a later date. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you. Bye-bye. Hello, my dear friends. Hope this message finds you well. If you like the way this channel is going and the channel has been a blessing to you, please consider supporting the channel by going to the website, TaNaChTalk.com, TaNaChTalk.com. Thank you once again for your time and for supporting TaNaCh Talk. Shalom.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה